Hi everyone, wishing you all a happy and peaceful Easter if you mark it. We've just had Good Friday. I'm pulling an all-nighter doing some paperwork, sorting out a few other things. I've been watching also WrestleMania on and off, WrestleMania 41 from Las Vegas. Occasionally I go back into my wrestling interests. I wouldn't call myself a huge wrestling fan, but there's enough of an interest there to, watch Royal Rumbles, to watch and certainly watch a WrestleMania. But anyway, as I was browsing social media, a post came up on my feed said that in Brazil, and I should caveat this by saying that this is just information, so I really don't know the details. But apparently in Brazil, there's a rehabilitation program whereby inmates get 4 days off their sentence for every book that they read and comprise a report on. And the books are pre-arranged, so ostensibly that would be to avoid books that would be maybe not exactly healthy for the inmate. I mean, there may be publications advocating for crime or violence or something. But anyway, it's got a lot of people responding to this positively. As always with rehabilitation, I'm a bit more cautious. And I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about this because crime and justice is one of the subjects I feel strongest about. I mean, it's certainly when it comes to domestic issues, it's probably at the very top of my radar. It's something I feel very strongly about. I always have. And I really strongly believe that rehabilitation cannot take place without first having judicial punishment. You can't have one without the other. I really believe that. Um, but I want to lay out how I see this. And as always with these sort of videos, there will be people who disagree with me. Feel free to leave your comments and say why. Basically, I think that in most cases, rehabilitation is obviously important. It's a good thing because it should tie hand in hand with recidivism, or rather, reducing recidivism. That is to say, the chance of an offender reoffending. Because obviously, if someone does a custodial sentence and they come out and just reoffend, then something not working there. So a focus on rehabilitation is important. But if you listen to left-leaning people when it comes to crime, they act as if rehabilitation is never attempted, like it doesn't exist. That's simply not true. And there's another narrative in this country that I really dislike from the left, which is we just throw people away. Actually, there's many serious criminals who avoid prison, in my view, disgracefully so. There's career criminals who notch up offence after offence after offence, and eventually they may get a custodial sentence, but it takes too long for that to happen. Research has actually shown that when career criminals receive a custodial sentence, it significantly reduces crime. I'm citing Dr. Lawrence Newport in that regard. Now, if that is effective, then clearly that should be done more. I would take the view, if I'm a judge, if I have a defendant before me who has notched up offence after offence after offence, I think it would be criminally absurd to give that person a community sentence. You know, it may be, if it's a first offence, and depending on what that offence is, I certainly wouldn't um, be looking at jailing someone who's a first time shoplifter, for example. Um, but then again, it depends what the crime is. Someone may have only committed rape once, but rape is a very serious crime. So it's not necessarily how many crimes a person's committed either, it's also the seriousness of that crime. But the principle of rehabilitation is to prepare that person for the outside world and to be a better citizen. That's obviously a good thing, it's good for everyone. I do think though that often when rehabilitation is brought up, when the subject of rehabilitation is brought up, and again I prefix this by the thing I cited in Brazil, I'm only scratching the surface. I don't know how effective that program is. I don't know how Brazilians feel about it. I don't know, if you are Brazilian, do let me know. But as a principle, obviously, it's a good thing. In most cases, even murder, I don't think someone should necessarily spend the rest of their days behind bars. I think premeditated murder, of course, it's one of the most serious crimes and should be a very, very long sentence. But I would reserve whole life tariffs for the worst of the worst, such as child murder, um, terrorists, prolific predators, like really the worst of the worst. But for most other crimes, even serious crimes, I would advocate long sentences, but not necessarily a whole life tariff. Because for one thing, it's costly. It's costly to have someone in prison for a whole life sentence. In Britain, a life sentence isn't really a life sentence. I mean, the sentencing council will argue it actually is because when they're out of prison, they're monitored for the rest of their life. But that isn't how the public sees it. When the public hear life sentence, what they want to know is that person behind bars for the rest of their life. We need to change the terminology to be a bit more honest, at least reflective of how the public sees that. I I am, I am, and remain very skeptical of the sentencing council. Despite what they claim, I don't think they're really in tune with opinion. They do carry out public consultations, but those consultations are limited. Sentencing, although it's actually increased in the last 20 years on average, it's still far too soft. You get serious crimes like, for instance, a reckless driver paralyzes someone for life, they get a few years in prison. I think that is disgraceful. I take the view if you kill someone or seriously injure someone whilst reckless driving, dangerous driving, especially if alcohol or drugs are involved, you should get a very long sentence and you should never be allowed behind a wheel again. I don't see any reasonable logic as to why that person is allowed to drive after, say, 7 years or something. That makes no sense to me because driving is a privilege, it isn't a right. If they had a job that relied on driving, tough. They'll have to just get another job. They have to make alternative arrangements in that regard. Um, Youth crime, I think, sentencing far too soft. I think young offenders in this country feel enabled because they themselves know that their age kind of protects them. Most will get is a community sentence, or if it's a really serious crime like murder, they'll get so many years in the Young Offenders Institute. But I still think it's far too lenient. I don't really agree with the logic that because an offender is young, they should get a much softer sentence. Obviously, it shouldn't be quite the same as an adult, but if a 16-year-old commits a heinous crime, why should the 16-year-old be given a very lenient sentence when that crime has destroyed lives? I just don't see any. If the logic is, oh, will they have a chance of reforming? That's very naive. Because my view is, if they've committed such a heinous crime in the first place, um, the chances of them reforming are minimal. And even if there is a chance there is a principle of fairness. Because the thing about rehabilitation, yes, it's in everyone's interest that the offender becomes a better citizen. But I am absolutely adamant that you cannot have it without, first of all, having judicial punishment. And I think a lot of people on the left, their attitude to this is punishment is punitive. So we should just have rehabilitation immediately. No punishment, just rehabilitation. That is stupid. It's absolutely stupid. Um, because for one thing, if you have an angry and bitter defender, that they're not going to see the error of their ways if you just immediately put them onto some sort of program to, learn about art or literature or something. They have to understand that they're paying a price for what they've done. And that means a stiff sentence because without that, the judicial system is telling them, well, you've done this terrible thing, but you're not really going to face major consequences for that. I just think that is perverse. So I am an advocate of tough justice because I think it does serve a role. I don't think it's punitive. I think it serves a role. It serves a role in terms of giving the victim justice. It serves a role in terms of telling the offender you're paying a price for what you've done. It serves a role in terms of protecting the public because it's reckless to have a dangerous person walking the streets. There's a lot of reasons why it does serve a role. But the liberal left attitude to punishment is always like they give its knee jerk hostility to it. And they always tend to think of the victim second. They will say, Oh, but it's if we get rehabilitation, it helps the victim. Well, I agree with that, but only if punishment has come first. You cannot have rehabilitation without judicial punishment coming first. And I really take issue with anyone who argues that you can, because it's nonsense. It's nonsensical, in fact. Um, Now, in terms of what form the rehabilitation should take, it probably depends on the crime. It depends on the particular circumstances of the offender. There will be different aggravating and mitigating circumstances. I would be a lot more sympathetic to people who done a reckless thing in the heat of the moment, but may have been in a circumstance where, for example, they had no previous offences, but it was a moment's madness. I'd be more sympathetic to those sort of people. Where you have career criminals, then the notion of rehabilitation is a bit of a joke. I think in those cases, they need a much longer sentence. And when rehabilitation is brought into it, it has to be with very strong caveats. There was a case that was brought up where this evil thug, I can't think of any other way to describe him, gouged the eyes out of his girlfriend. And this is not an exaggeration, that's what he done. Now, he initially got a minimum of 6 years, which is pathetic. He has served 10 years. Now he's, I understand, in the Category C prison, and he may well be due for release soon. But this is someone who has shown no real remorse for the crimes. This is someone who I think would still be a danger to the public. And not to mention the fact it's about one of the most evil things you can do, taking away precious sense of sight. That is, to me, that is an absolutely heinous, brutal, savage crime. I would have given that thug a starting point of 12 years, a starting point. Um, to me, that's pretty much as bad as you can get without killing someone. I mean, sight is something that scares me. Losing sight, it's not something, that scares me. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up soon, but that's basically how I see rehabilitation. I do support it. I do think it has a role. And you do get examples of people who have committed serious crimes and do genuinely want to change their life and they do genuinely have remorse. And it would be a bit punitive for society to say, okay, you've done your time, but we're not going to let you out or we're not going to let you change your ways. That would be punitive and it wouldn't really help anyone. So if someone has recognized they crossed a line, they hurt someone else, and they genuinely show remorse and they want to change, then I'm all for that. With the caveat that they do show genuine remorse and they have done time for that. But the liberal left attitude to this, they don't even seem to consider if the person has shown genuine remorse. Their attitude is just, well, it's rehabilitation, it's a good thing. Let's not even consider if the offender genuinely wants to change. Now, how do you rehabilitate someone who has no remorse? That's nonsense. That's my challenge to the liberal left. How do you rehabilitate someone who doesn't have remorse? How do you say to that person, well, you've done this terrible thing. We're going to give you an opportunity for early release if you read a few books or take part in a few educational courses. Um, because actually, there's another point to it. Those are actually advantages. Those are helping that person. And victims of crime might well ask, well, wait a second, what about helping the victim who's serving a life sentence? Shouldn't the judicial system put just as much focus into giving that person some sort of, indeed, rehabilitation? Because when we talk about rehabilitation, you know, we can think of it in terms of judicial rehabilitation. But what if someone suffered a serious injury because of the actions of another? They're going through medical rehabilitation, you know? So there is a moral question. The state is paying money to rehabilitate offenders, but are they paying money to help the victims? Because even if there is a stiff sentence, that person could be serving a whole life tariff. Like the woman who was paralyzed from the waist down because of a teenage reckless driver. Now, I understand he did show remorse, but the sentence he got, 2 years, utterly pathetic, and it shames the sentencing council. It's that sort of thing that I think infuriates the public and just it erodes trust. So anyway, I'm going to wrap this one up. There's always I can always think of things to talk about regarding the subject of crime and justice, but specifically on the subject of rehabilitation, support it if it comes after judicial punishment. If the offender is willing to change, that means genuinely showing remorse, recognizing what they have done wrong. I guess the only caveat there, or the only difference would be in cases where there are serious question marks over a potential miscarriage of justice, in which case I wouldn't expect someone who has been the victim of a miscarriage of justice to show remorse, because that would be admitting to a crime that they haven't committed. That, that's a different situation. But in terms of people who have been found guilty and they are guilty, I would say, okay, you really want to change. Um, you shouldn't be thinking about reducing your sentence. You should be thinking, okay, I'm paying a price for what I've done. Because if the offender's focus is on trying to reduce their sentence, are they really showing remorse? Think of it that way. If they're really eager to get out early, um, are they really considering their victim, or are they just protecting themselves? They're just thinking, oh, well, I want to, because obviously no one wants to be in prison. I will say one thing, which I disagree with the right. Sometimes we hear in the tabloids that British prisons are soft and they're easygoing. We hear of things like prisoners getting certain privileges. Certainly, the recent attack by the Manchester Arena bomber is shocking, and there definitely needs to be a big review into some of the things going on there. Having said that, one area I would disagree with the right is the idea that British prisons are picnics. I don't think they are. I think they're pretty tough places. I think they're a lot tougher than their Nordic equivalents. And they shouldn't be. They shouldn't be nice places. My basic view on prison, and this is perhaps going into another realm, but rehabilitation starts in prison. I don't think prisons should be hellholes. I don't think they should be brutal and barbaric, and there shouldn't be a situation where the inmates take over. But nor should they be particularly pleasant. People are there for a reason: protect the public, to be punished for the crime they've committed. So it shouldn't be particularly pleasant. It should be, a situation where they're having basic human rights respected. They have exercise, they have decent food, um, perhaps religious observances are upheld, that sort of thing. But I think that you get extremes. You get certain types of penal situations that we see in Latin America, which are like human battery farms. I think that's extreme. But then you get the Nordic model, which I'm not convinced by. I think it's insane to have, for example, an axe murderer um, being given hotel-like accommodation. It's just, uh, I really am skeptical of that, particularly as we see in the Nordic states actually rising crime levels, particularly in Sweden. Um, so I think the British system is actually, it's certainly nothing to shout about. And, I don't take any pleasure, believe it or not, from hearing of inmate suicide. It's not a good thing. It shouldn't be so hellish that that is permitted. Prison staff have very low morale at the moment. They need to be given a lot more support. There needs to be much more scrutiny of how prisons are run in terms of extremists, in terms of how extremists are indoctrinating others. And the issue of bullying in prisons is a big issue now. I'll also address something else. I am not actually in favor of prison vigilantism. Sometimes you hear of particular inmates who are despised by others, for example, particularly child sex offenders. It's understandable because society in generally finds such people repulsive. I do. But I don't think there's anything to shout about here, for example, an armed robber um, beat up a predator. That doesn't make the armed robber any better. Um, and the problem with that is when people kind of glorify prison vigilantism, it's the prison staff that are dealing with that. And their morale is very low. I don't think there's anything to celebrate when inmates are taking over. So I think there needs to be much more support given to prison staff because right now the morale is very low. They need a lot more support. Labour broke its promise. It said it would build more prison places. Now it's backtracking on that. Um, because they shouldn't have made those promises during the election. Um, and there are questions about two-tier justice. I mean, I've no problem with violent rioters getting a prison sentence, but why is it then that you get other crimes, like for example, Hugh Edwards avoided a prison sentence, or you get the woman who I spoke about recently, Lucy Connolly, I believe her name is, serving a long custodial sentence for essentially a social media post. That's wrong. Especially since she's shown remorse for what she wrote. I mean, there's serious, serious flaws in our justice system. It's not the worst in the world, actually, but it's bad enough that trust is very low. Anyway, I will wrap this up. Rehabilitation is a good thing. I support it, but it has to come with those caveats. Genuine remorse, a genuine willingness to change, the offender having served significant time for what they've done. The more serious the crime, the longer the sentence should be. And yeah, the victims have to be put into central consideration. There needs to be more support given to victims. I'm not saying it's non-existent, but if there's going to be money spent on rehabilitating offenders, then there should also be money spent on helping victims. Let me know your thoughts.